Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Mishcon Retail Academy session. Today, we're looking at facial recognition, and the session is called Facing the Future, Lawful Use of Facial Recognition in Retail. So who are we? I'm James Boyle. I'm a partner in the data team here at Mishcon, and I'm joined today by Louise Schofield, one of our incredible associates in the data team here today. Really pleased to be here. Thank you for joining. In terms of the structure that we'll run through today with the 45 minutes we have, we're going to start by kind of working through what are the two types of facial recognition that we tend to come across in our day-to-day practice. Then for those of you that are here today that perhaps aren't super familiar with kind of key data protection topics, we're also going to introduce you to some of the really kind of foundational concepts that apply in facial recognition. So we'll look briefly at things like what do we mean when we say personal data, and what's a controller, what's a processor. And then we'll move on from those to really apply all of those concepts into two case studies. One will be applying facial recognition for the purposes of effectively theft, fraud detection, helping your employees arrive on time, that kind of thing. And the second case study will be applying facial recognition in more of a marketing context. And then we'll close the presentation today with more of a look at how are different facial recognition technologies being used globally. And then there should be some time for Q&A afterwards.
So a good place to start is with what facial recognition is. So it is a technology that uses algorithms, quite often AI, to identify faces in images. And the images can be static or moving. And the technology will create a map of faces, and these are often referred to as face maps or face prints. And throughout this presentation, we will generally refer to them as face prints. So in terms of how the technology actually works, it will take measurements between identifiable points on faces, and then create maps that can be converted into code. And then it is the code that is compared. Different facial recognition models use different numbers of identifiable points, but usually it's sort of upward of 30. And the output, which is the numbers that you see in the nice little animation we have on screen, is what's compared. So there's quite a few stages in this, and it's much more processing than just an image-to-image comparison that you might be familiar with that's been around for a long time. And there are two different kinds of facial recognition technology, normal facial recognition technology and then live facial recognition. So the facial recognition technology is just a one-to-one process, very much like you saw on the last slide with my face and James's face. It's also the kind of thing that is used to unlock your phone, where the you that is unlocking your phone is compared to the stored images on the phone of your face. It tends to be something that participants are aware of, that they actively consent to, and there's very selective processing when this happens. Whereas with live facial recognition, that is something that's usually deployed through an existing CCTV system or through cameras that are set up in a space. That is constant comparison that's happening and screening of faces, and it can be done without participants realizing that it's happening. So it is a much more mass scale collection and processing of data.
And so as we move on to look at like what are the sort of data protection compliance considerations that apply to the deployment of facial recognition technology, I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page in terms of the key concepts and effectively jargon that we'll be discussing through the rest of this session. And so the data protection laws regulate something called personal data. A useful question to ask around whether something is or isn't personal data is to look at, well, does the information relate to a living individual you can identify? And classic examples of personal data would be those that you can see on the screen. So things like name, ID number, an IP address, as well as someone's employer and financial details. The term is really, really broadly defined, so this isn't an exhaustive list. Another way that I find quite helpful in terms of working out whether something or not is personal data is to ask whether, do you hold enough information to distinguish someone from a group? An example of that could be there is someone on this webinar wearing glasses who is visible. And at the moment, I'm the only person on this webinar wearing glasses that's visible. So what we're not saying is that you should be effectively be treating everything as personal data, but I use that example to illustrate quite how broadly interpreted the definition of personal data is. And so because we're talking about facial recognition, it's also worth mentioning that in addition to the sort of typical types of personal data I mentioned on the last slide, there's an additional type of personal data called special category data, which is highly relevant to facial recognition. And you can see on the slide that these data types are really the much more sensitive ones. So we're talking about things like racial, ethnic origin, political opinions, data about someone's sex life or their sexual orientation, or data relating to their health or genetic or biometric data. And so what's particularly relevant to facial recognition face prints is the biometric data. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment here to really think about like what a face print is. It's an intrinsically private character of a face. Changing your face is a lot more difficult than changing various other personal data points. It's often significantly more expensive and painful to change your face than it is to change other personal data points. Face prints could also allow identification with surprising accuracy, given the uniqueness. It's also very much like a kind of fingerprint or DNA. And so face prints are considered biometric data. And I think one of the kind of tricky things of biometric data is that it will be special category data if it's used for the purpose of uniquely identifying an actual person. We flag this because in some circumstances, biometric data may not be special category data, but certainly for the purposes of facial recognition, all face prints that are taken for use in facial recognition, and whether that's live or static, going back to the two types that Louise mentioned earlier, should be considered special category data. So if you're still with me, what we're going to do now is just walk you through a couple more of the key legal concepts to be aware of, and then we will start applying that to various case studies. So once we've established that the face print is special category data, a natural next step then is to consider whether you're acting as a controller or a processor over that data. The answer to this question is critical because it hugely alters your compliance obligations, whether or not you're a controller or a processor. And so as a very rough rule of thumb, if you are a retail business deploying facial recognition, you are much more likely to be a controller than you are a processor. Whereas if you are a technology provider, effectively licensing your facial recognition technology to a customer who could be, say, a supermarket, you're more likely to be a processor. You can see on the slide the kind of indicators and questions you can ask to help you work out if you're a controller or a processor. The other key thing to mention here, though, and where it can get more complex, particularly in a large retail environment, is if the owner and operator are different around particular retail sites, or if a landlord wants to be able to share face prints amongst a couple of different estates they have. In those circumstances, it's possible that a relationship called joint controllership will spring up. This is effectively where you have more than one party effectively deciding how and why the data is used and how it's shared between them. So it's not something we're going to go into a huge amount of detail on today because I'm keen to get on to the practical case studies, but just worth flagging that if you're in a franchise arrangement, or if you have a kind of owner-operator, landlord style arrangement and you're looking at facial recognition technology, joint controllership may well be relevant there. And so once we've established that we are processing personal data and special category data, and that we're a data controller of that information, the key next step is to identify what's called a lawful basis for that processing. I find it helpful to think of the lawful bases almost like a menu or a shopping list here. And effectively, unless you can identify at least one of them to pin your processing on, your use of that data won't be lawful. The Article 6 bases you can see listed here. I won't repeat them all for you, but the one we see most often that our clients rely on will be their legitimate interests. The other one that's more contentious to rely on that we can cover as well today is around consent. And so I mentioned earlier that when you are relying on, if you're processing special category data, then it can be a bit more difficult and additional rules apply. One of those additional rules is that you also need to identify an Article 9 lawful basis for that processing. The two here that we see being particularly common for our clients to rely on when they use facial recognition will be explicit consent, but again, that's quite a problematic one to rely on generally, as well as the processing being in the substantial public interest.
So the Information Commissioner, who's the regulator for data protection in the UK, has issued some guidance about live facial recognition. And we have extracted some of the issues that they identify in their guidance and added some of our own. And so we've split those into categories. So one of the issues, which is automatic collection of data at scale, there are lots of things to consider with this, particularly some of the data protection principles that you need to abide by. It's very difficult to restrict processing, particularly if you're using live facial recognition in a public space. So that can lead to things like indiscriminate processing. And there are also other considerations around collection of data from children and vulnerable people, because there is a higher level of protection afforded to those groups. Individuals also cannot control whether their data is being collected and processed in public spaces. And so the requirements surrounding transparency and necessity are particularly topical for the ICO. So you need to make sure that you're being transparent and explain how and why data is being processed. And we'll go into this a little bit more detail in the case study. Other things to consider that are perhaps more practical is how effective live facial recognition technology is. Many programs that use facial recognition are not actually statistically accurate, and they can produce false positives and negatives. So you need to consider the impact of that on the purpose that you're trying to achieve. And also make sure that you're scrutinizing the technology that you're implementing appropriately. AI systems that run facial recognition are notorious for having racial and gender bias. And regardless of where the model comes from, Chinese-based models often inaccurately identify more Western faces, and more Western models that come out of Silicon Valley have been known to struggle with accuracy for non-white faces. So it's an issue regardless of where you get your software from. So you need to make sure that you're interrogating it. And then finally, function creep. If you're implementing facial recognition for security purposes, you need to make sure that you're not then using the technology for something else just because you can. So in the example of, say, supermarket security, you need to make sure that you're not then using it to track footfall in and out of your store. So the ICO also summarise some of the legal requirements that they suggest that you take, which we've included on the slide. I don't propose to go through them all, but they are very important, and they are of a theme. So the compliance with the data protection principles is very important. Identifying and meeting the lawful bases that James explained earlier on in the presentation, and then ensuring that data subjects can exercise their rights are all very important. DPIAs, data protection impact assessments, will almost certainly be needed, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But you may need to consult with the ICO, and they are very open to that in their guidance. I also wanted to flag some points included in the EU AI Act. We are not EU lawyers, but it does perhaps suggest the direction of travel for regulation in this area. And the EU AI Act has quite strict restrictions that place bans on the use of facial recognition technology, except for very specified purposes. So I've summarized a little bit about what the EU AI Act says here. But what's interesting is since the Act was published, interest groups like Amnesty International have actually said that it doesn't go far enough and they want more comprehensive bans. So it is an area where we might see a bit of push and pull on the regulation.
And so what we're going to do now is look to anchor these key concepts into a couple of case studies. So what I'd like to do now is introduce you to two scenarios. So let's say in the first case that facial recognition technology is being introduced to improve warehouse security at Oil Store Co. They have approximately 200 employees, along with a mix of permanent and short-term staff. We're talking about a fixed location here, and the only use is to effectively enable entry and exit from the warehouse. We also, as part of this case study, are looking at theft deterrence, so an implementation of facial recognition to help look at, is a person coming into Schofield's corner shop, someone who's stolen from that shop before. It's powered by a third-party provider, will involve monitoring the public, as well as engagement with internal and external watch lists.
And one thing to note about the watch list before we move on is that the ICO addresses the use of watch lists in their guidance specifically, and they ask that you consider when using them the impact of social stigma when people are placed on watch lists. That if you're using watch lists that are shared or contributing to law enforcement watch lists, that you consider whether you're compliant in that data sharing relationship, which would include things like the controllership James was talking about earlier. They also request that you limit the retention to prevent people staying on watch lists for an unnecessary period. And then they specify things that wouldn't be appropriate to place someone on a watch list for, which includes minor offences, where people's face prints have been captured where they would have no expectation that facial recognition was taking place, and also extraction of face prints from third-party sources like social media, other resources online, and some third-party services. And they say that it's unlikely that any of those sources or reasons for adding people to a watch list would satisfy the requirements of necessity and proportionality.
So if we look at the available benefits associated with the facial recognition technology, some of the things our clients will often think about when implementing this tech will be, well, it can help us secure the site and stuff. It removes the risk associated with stolen passes, and it's cheaper than hiring 24 security guards. If we compare this to the implementation at Schofield's corner shop, it potentially increases the ability to prosecute, acts as a general deterrent as well. And the watch list means that crime can be prevented before it happens. One of the sort of problems here, though, is that data protection law is really anchored around proportionality and fairness. And so it doesn't strike me that this technology, for example, being cheaper, or the ability to prevent crime before it happens, are a particularly compelling way of satisfying the legal requirements here under the data protection principles. And so as we work through the issues associated with the implementation of this tech, if we work through the legal bases for the warehouse security at Boylstor Code first, and this one is in connection with employees. Typically, the lawful bases that we would usually see our clients defend in this space would be legitimate interests and the substantial public interest condition, or going down the consent route. The consent route is particularly difficult to go down if we're looking at an employer-employee context here. The starting point, I would say, is that consent shouldn't be relied on as a lawful basis unless you are able to show that you have genuinely offered employees a range of alternative, far less invasive options. Choosing any of those options won't impact their career progression. They won't be at all pressured to choose one of those options. It's quite rarely used by our clients, and it's more difficult to implement. But I would say generally, if like very, very careful thought is being given to the various alternative mechanisms being offered, then consent in an employee context could be viable, subject to all of those caveats. The other issues we then look at around employee monitoring will be particularly in relation to, well, is there a less invasive option here? How are our employees likely to react to being monitored at work or having face prints taken of them, as well as sort of public reputational angle here. I think if we were going to sort of draw a conclusion on this one, that the warehouse security one is viable in principle, provided it's not being forced on employees and requires a detailed set of effectively compliance considerations to be made around how can we minimize the invasive privacy elements of this technology on the employees, which Louise will cover a little bit later. If we then look at the theft deterrence example, with this one, we have much broader scanning of a user base. So we're not limiting this to effectively 200 employees, each of whom are fully informed and given a general choice. On this implementation, I think the legal bases that would apply here are likely to be the same as the ones for warehouse security, with the caveat that I think consent is effectively non-viable here because it's essentially impossible to collect consent to the standard you would need to under the legislation for this technology. It's also quite clear that in terms of public support for this, it's fairly low. We come up against the same problem here, that there are less invasive options that exist. Certainly my view on the theft deterrence as a general scanning of members of the public is it's extremely difficult to justify this approach from a data protection perspective.
It's also something that is being challenged. So Big Brother Watch is one of the big organizations that is kind of challenging businesses that are trying to implement facial recognition. They recently announced that they successfully negotiated with a gym group to remove facial recognition from 55 of their locations. And they've also written complaints to the ICO, including one in relation to the co-op's use of facial recognition in their stores, which is available on Big Brother Watch's website. And I encourage you to take a look at it if you're considering implementing this technology, just to see the kind of challenges that they include there. but it includes comments around transparency and fairness, as well as whether the legal bases that were relied on were the appropriate ones for the store's use of live facial recognition. So in order to mitigate some of these issues, there are a few things that you can do. The first one is definitely to complete a data protection impact assessment. And it can be quite difficult to start from scratch with those, particularly when it comes to identifying the risks, which I think James had something he wanted to add to.
The point that I would make here around DPIAs is that if you're someone that's tasked with completing a DPIA, I can often find at the start of that process, working out what the risks could be is really difficult. You effectively almost have to lock yourself in a room and just think about, how could all of this go wrong? Like, how might people object to it? And like, what are the more general, like, moral, ethical, and social issues associated with this? And so if you're in a position of having to complete a DPIA or a compliance assessment in connection with facial recognition, the resource that I would suggest looking at is an academic paper called The Taxonomy of Privacy. If any of you would like a copy of it or a link, I'm happy to send that to you after the session. And the reason why I tend to use that as my touchstone when completing DPIAs is that it gives a really broad overview of effectively a huge range of privacy risks that could come up in different scenarios. I was looking at it this morning in prep for today, and the ones that struck me as being particularly relevant for facial recognition DPIAs are the risks of aggregation, insecurity, surveillance, secondary use, intrusion, exclusion, exposure, and distress. And so I just really encourage anyone who might be in this space struggling to work through a DPA or a compliance assessment to dip into some of that academic text. I find it consistently incredibly helpful.
And then in addition to that, there are some other things that you can do. So you need to interrogate your suppliers to see what they're doing with the data. Anyone who is storing the face prints, you need to ensure that they have appropriate security and technical measures in place. As we've already discussed, controllership will be a key issue that you'll need to consider when entering into your agreements with suppliers. If you're using a third-party software or a third-party CCTV or camera system, you also need to consider those agreements and make sure that, again, the data protection clauses and security measures are in place. We've already briefly mentioned watch lists, but if you're contributing to a watch list that is supplied by several different controllers, you may need to consider how the relationship and data flows work there. We don't suggest reusing the data, but if you are reusing data that you collect for something like a watch list, you may also want to consider if that has any implications on the contracts that you have in place with your suppliers. We also suggest that you complete a review of your processes, and that could include things like suggesting that before any action is taken when a face print is matched with an individual who might be on a watch list, whether human intervention is appropriate. That has been used in other tests of live facial recognition as a way of reducing the statistical imbalance and false positives. You also want to consider what an appropriate risk level is for your business. Your business may have more of an appetite for risk of things like ICO enforcement, public relations issues. So when completing your DPIA, you also might want to consider that. We do suggest that you run a trial. This might help you assess how your customers or your employees, depending where you're implementing the technology, feel about the use. And this runs alongside engaging with your customers. If they're really against it, it really won't be of any benefit to you to have a reduction in customer support. And then the most important thing is to consider whether, perhaps after the DPIA, is to consider whether there are other less invasive options that are more suitable. So for these two case studies, there are a variety of things that may be more suitable. For the employee example, security guards, doormen, electronic security passes or ID code swipe systems are very useful. If you're in more of a retail environment, then things like electronic security tagging, which a lot of shops already have in place, can be quite useful alongside other measures like CCTV and security guards. And in some scenarios, if you have luxury goods, having some kind of interlocking or man-trap door may be more suitable.
And so what we'll do now is come on to a second series of case studies, more applying facial recognition to marketing. And so let's say that there are a range of niche marketing displays out on the streets and on the escalators down to tube stations. The objective really of facial recognition here is to assess and profile people that are passing by, and to really make sure that the adverts that people are seeing on these displays are tailored to them. These displays also have the ability to track eye movement, so checking whether the individual is actually appropriately engaged with what's being displayed, and can also derive emotions based on the facial recognition. And so from the organization's perspective, the thinking behind implementing this tech could be that, well, you know, these kind of real-time statistics and metrics related to engagement are incredibly useful. Like, we never usually have access to that kind of data. And it helps us ensure that our advertisers are able to reach users that are more directly engaged with this. And they can build a more detailed profile about these individuals than ever before. The real issue with this is that, well, to cut a long story short, I don't think it's possible to do this in a compliant way. There is incredibly low support for this kind of ad tracking and deployment of facial recognition technology. The emotional recognition side of things has previously been called out by the ICO and other regulators as technology that is simply not accurate enough and can't be deployed legally. This kind of implementation, it seems extremely difficult to find a legal basis to rely on. I don't think there's any way you could argue that this is in the substantial public interest. I also think it's extremely difficult to try and collect consent from people as they walk past these displays, because I don't think anybody would give that consent. It also strikes me that there are a range of like much less invasive options that could be considered here. As we move on to look at the sort of, you know, if this kind of tech was being introduced, like what are the mitigation and compliance considerations that would apply? You'll see that the kind of checklist or to-do list here is largely the same as for the previous case studies. But I think that the real kind of thing to keep in mind here, particularly when we start to think about the less invasive options, is that there simply are much less invasive options here that might not be, strictly speaking, as effective as using facial recognition technology. But I think as we go through the various balancing tests that data protection law requires you to do, I certainly can't see a way that completing those balancing tests, if they're done properly, would give you an outcome or a conclusion that this use of facial recognition technology is compliant and appropriate. The one that leaps out at me is Bluetooth tracking here, which is often done by retailers as you walk past particular stores. If you have the app installed, then you'll often receive a push notification from those stores. This strikes me as a, you know, still fairly invasive but much less invasive option than facial recognition technology, which also allows that detailed advertiser tracking.
So finally, we're just going to move on to some more general points about facial recognition and how it's used all around the world. So the first thing is that it's not new technology. We think about it as being new technology, but the first trial that I was able to find records of actually took place in London in 1998. I will say, though, that it's never really been very popular when it's been trialed, and a lot of the media surrounding it has been fairly critical. When facial recognition was implemented in the Super Bowl in 2001, interestingly, pre 9/11, there was quite a widespread backlash against it, and it earned itself the nickname Snooper Bowl. And commercial systems have been available since 2007, so it has slowly been gaining kind of traction in the space of kind of surveillance and security. And more recently, the Las Vegas police have been consulting with the Las Vegas Raiders, which is another NFL team, to introduce facial recognition into their stadium as part of their security. And there are queries around whether that's appropriate or whether it will be rolled out to other NFL stadiums. That are ongoing discussions within the media and the public. Facial recognition is very topical. A lot of people are aware of it because it does get a lot of press. Things like China's social scoring is a very well-known example, which I think kind of gained a little bit more recognition after the Black Mirror episodes that use or highlight facial recognition. But it's something that's likely to have happened to everyone who is online, as Clearview AI have been in the press recently for the past few years, as they've scraped image searches online to look for faces to train their algorithm. And in some cases, Clearview AI is, and that program is being deployed by law enforcement. So that is something that impacts us all. Many people will be aware of Face ID that's on Apple iPhones. When it was introduced in, I think, 2017, there's quite a lot of pushback. People didn't like the idea that facial recognition was being used on their mobile device, which interestingly had a similar backlash when Touch ID, which was a fingerprint-based unlocking system, was introduced. So you can see that there is a general kind of public dissatisfaction with the use of biometrics, whether that's fingerprints or face prints. But even so, the technology is being used. In the UK, it's being tested in the Premier League and at some rugby matches. But there are challenges in place from organizations like Big Brother Watch and also Liberty, who brought the only facial recognition case in the UK against the South Wales Police, which is about more law enforcement use than commercial use. But it's definitely something that is at the forefront of the public's mind. Something else to consider is how facial recognition fits in more widely into big data. And there are two examples on the screen of how other tracking through loyalty schemes identified information about individuals. I particularly remember when the Target example came out, because a lot of people were outraged that such like shopping habits could be used to find out that someone was pregnant before their family members did. So when you're deploying this technology, it's good to think about what I like to call the creepy factor, and how your deployment of the facial recognition technology will fit into your other tracking and data collection. I'm quickly going to talk about what's happening in Australia, because two stores in Australia, Kmart and Bunnings. Kmart is a kind of grocery and home goods store, and Bunnings, which is kind of similar to stores here like Screwfix or Homebase, it sells hardware goods. They implemented facial recognition technology very much in the way that you saw in our first case study, and used signposting. Now, the law is slightly different in Australia, but following a challenge from Choice, which is an advocacy group, the Australian Information Commissioner essentially said that it wasn't appropriate, and really pushed back on its use by these two stores, because they said that consent should be required for such sensitive information because you can't change your face, and people wouldn't have been aware that facial recognition was happening. And on the public relations point, this was very widely reported in the press, both in Australia and in the UK. The article on the right-hand side of your screen about Bunnings was published in The Guardian in the UK. So it is something to consider when you're deploying this technology, what your plan would be from a public relations perspective if you did get pushback. And then finally, the use of facial recognition is being challenged everywhere that it's being used. On the slide, there are a few examples of different approaches taken by different regulators. It's worth bearing in mind that the lawful bases in each of these countries are slightly different, but it is interesting to see that places like San Francisco have enough support to kind of ban facial recognition across a whole city, which is particularly interesting when you consider the number of people from Silicon Valley that are likely to enter San Francisco. So these are just other things to bear in mind. The Council of Europe point at the bottom of the slide is also quite interesting, particularly in light of the EU AI Act, because it does suggest that more regulation is likely in this area.
And so in terms of some key takeaways from today's session, I think when deploying facial recognition technology, it's always worth keeping in mind that less invasive methods almost always exist here. And the principles of data protection law put great pressure on deployers of these systems to implement those less invasive methods or justify in detail why they've decided to go down the facial recognition option instead. Generally speaking, like our view is that it's extremely difficult to justify the use of facial recognition at the moment. It's possible that as technology moves on and cultural attitudes change, that the legal position will flex around this as well. One of the key things to complete if you're implementing facial recognition technology is to complete a data protection impact assessment or a DPIA. And I think many of you listening will be familiar with the requirement that if you don't feel like you can satisfactorily mitigate the risks in a DPIA, you need to consult with the ICO. It's likely that if you're deploying facial recognition technology, you may well also need to appoint a data protection officer. And then we've covered in a decent amount of detail requirements for the data protection principles, the lawful bases in Article 6 and Article 9, ensuring data subjects can exercise their rights. So effectively making sure that an individual can write in and say, you know, I want to erase my data, I want a copy of the data you hold about me, and various other rights they have, as well as taking a data protection by design and default approach. The real challenge here for retailers looking to deploy facial recognition technology is you are almost invariably reliant on your supplier doing these things, because your compliance here will partially be driven by how has the supplier developed their technology. So due diligence of the supplier here is critical. And those really were the key takeaways. And with 2 minutes to spare, that brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope those of you watching today found it useful. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us over email, or any questions, drop them in the chat. I can see we've got 2 questions at the moment, and the first question asks, we referred to, on the lawful bases, explicit consent and a substantial public interest condition in Article 9. Which substantial public interest condition were we referring to? That's a great question. For those of you that aren't familiar with data protection law as a person that asked the question, before you can rely on the substantial public interest condition, you then have to essentially go through a list of predefined examples of what is in the substantial public interest. The 2 that we see relied on most often are the prevention and detection of unlawful acts and protecting the public. It's also worth mentioning that as you go down that trail, it's likely that you will also need to complete something called an appropriate policy document, which helps underpin your argument that your processing is in the substantial public interest. The second question then asks, what would count as a minor crime? Would pickpocketing or shoplifting count as a petty crime? And does this not conflict with the intention of the shops, or the crimes likely to take place in shops? I think that question highlights a tension here around facial recognition generally, which is essentially the legislation puts the onus on the data controller to justify its decision making around whether, given how invasive facial recognition technology is, it's justified in dealing with the harm. So I could see, for example, how a shop that is really struggling with petty crime may be more inclined and maybe more successful at introducing facial recognition technology than another shop that has essentially no evidence of that crime being taken place, and also no evidence of having tried to implement much less invasive measures with any success. We've also had a question asking for the link on the paper on the taxonomy of privacy. Yes, absolutely, we will make that available to you. Thank you for asking. I think we're now over time, so I think we'll close here. But again, if anyone has any follow-up questions, please do reach out to us. And I really hope you found that engaging and useful for you. And thank you very much.
Thank you for joining.